So we're about to start our 2 o'clock program. For anyone coming that's new, thank you for coming. For our online viewers, if you have questions, please send them to umra@umich.edu. We have someone monitoring questions for our next session. So thank you again, and Al Hermsen will introduce our speaker.
It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Andrew Shuman, who I've really known since 1998. We recruited him with a new scholarship program that we had to attract top students to our undergraduate programs. In preparing for this, I had to think back. We got a gift of $6 million, and the provost said, we want to recruit top students with this scholarship. Set something up. And we did, and it set up a very successful program to bring top scholars, and one of them was Andy Shuman from Long Island. We later, because this group connected so well, set up a scholarship society, and Andy served as one of the presidents of the society. So I really got to know Andy very well over the years. He eventually graduated from LS&A and went on to medical school at U of M. And now is advanced to an associate professor in the Department of Otolaryngology, head and neck surgery at the medical school. He serves as chief, now I got to start reading this because I can't remember all this other stuff, but he now serves as chief of the Clinical Ethics Service in the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine. He is the Assistant Dean for Veterans Affairs and Associate Chief of Staff for Education at the Ann Arbor VA, where he directs the educational experiences of a diverse cadre of pre- and post-doctoral trainees and learners. He is internationally recognized as a thought leader in ethical issues arising from the field of otolaryngology and surgical oncology. He's received research funding from NIH and the VAs and the social societies, and has a portfolio of publications leading to journals of ethics, oncology, and otolaryngology. He has served as the principal investigator on projects focused on cancer treatment, decision-making, precision oncology, and drug shortages. He was closely involved with Michigan Medicines and the VA's pandemic response, as well as at the state and national level on ethics and scarce resource allocations, including testifying in front of the United States Senate recently. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Andrew Shuman.
It's a pleasure to be here. Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Are we okay? Good. So over the next half hour or so, we're going to talk through some issues related to drug shortages. This is a topic that obviously is not a light one, and one that's been around for a while. And I'll talk a little bit about the clinical side of what this involves, as well as some of the broader policy and national issues that I've become involved with in trying to get some responses to it. So first off, I want to thank you for having me today, to Al, who I've known for literally, got to do the math, 30 years basically at this point. Yeah. And to all of you for your kind welcome and introduction. I certainly know a few of you from my clinical days and as well as your work at Michigan Medicine. So thank you for all you've done for us. So I don't have any financial disclosures. I do have some funding sources for the research part of this, and I have and do work for the federal government, but I'm not representing the federal government today. So cisplatin is a drug. It's a cancer drug. It costs about $12 a vial. So this is not anything that is overly fancy or expensive. It's been around for many, many, many decades. It's used for a bunch of different kinds of cancer. It's used to treat head and neck cancer. It's used to treat pediatric cancer, genitourinary, and GYN cancers, among others. It is often used as part of cocktails, which is basically multiple drugs put together that we use to treat cancers in many different ways, shapes, and forms. And because of a number of variables that we'll talk about over the next 20 minutes or so, there's only a few producers of cisplatin across the world that feed the US. And one of those factories is an FDA-approved factory in India that was evaluated and checked by FDA and found essentially not to be up to snuff. It was not safe, it was not a reliable product, and that facility was shut down. But what that meant was that overnight, 1/3 of the supply of cisplatin to the United States basically disappeared. And what that meant is here at Michigan Medicine, we had to decide whether it goes to the baby with neuroblastoma, the plumber with head and neck cancer, the retired banker with bladder cancer, or the woman just diagnosed with a gynecologic cancer who's a single mom. And we found this out pretty quickly, without much notice. We also have no idea when the next truck is going to show up with the next doses of cisplatin, and need to come up with a fair, just, equitable rationing schema to give out a medication that literally costs less than 2 gallons of gas. So that sets the stage. There's many other ways of thinking about this. We run out of a lot of other things too. Propofol is a medication that's used in most anesthetic plans to keep people asleep. And as a surgeon, I'll tell you, it's important for people to be sleeping during surgery. So that doesn't mean we don't have other drugs. We do have other drugs. But anytime you're making substitutions, it creates chances for error, changes to the way we do things. And if you know anything about doctors, we like to do things the same way every time, whenever we can. And there's reasons for that. It's because it's safer, it's more efficient, it's more predictable. Sometimes things are out of our control. So for example, when a tornado takes out a facility that makes drug, including propofol, supply may become more unpredictable. That's less of a problem though if you have a whole lot more facilities. But when that's the only facility that Pfizer has that's stocking propofol for the entire East Coast, that's a problem. Why does that happen? Wait 10 minutes. So we'll talk a little bit about how drug shortages happen and why, a little bit about the ethical issues of deciding whether it goes to Bob or Jim or Molly or whoever else needs it, and how we talk about this on a more national stage to fix the problem. So this is a major problem that not only impacts people at the bedside, but has been a national one. And the only way we're going to solve it is not by me taking care of people at Michigan Medicine, but by federal action and legislative response. We'll get to that. Just to give you some numbers, I know you can't read them from where you are, and that's fine. The bottom line here is there's hundreds of medications we don't have on any given day across the country. This is not the number of times a drug is short. This is the number of medications like cisplatin, like propofol, that we are short on any given year. And that is 200 to 300 a year on average. These are the active shortages that we're seeing. And again, you can't see here, but the x-axis is years, and the y-axis here is amount of drug shortages. The top is 350, and that's right where we are right now. Here's Michigan Medicine data, which actually is worse. So one thing, when you're looking at national trends, those are only drugs that are not available across the whole country and are reported to either FDA or other major groups. But we know a lot of shortages happen locally and aren't necessarily felt nationally. And these ebb and flow in a different kind of a way than the national ones. So this shows the national trend. Again, x-axis is years, y-axis is number of drugs. The blue line at the bottom is at around 200, give or take, by the end of 22. The red line is a little higher. But if you look at the green line, that's Michigan Medicine. So we're missing out on about 450 drugs a year. And that's not because Michigan Medicine is worse than other hospitals. In fact, we're better. Other hospitals, probably the numbers are worse. We also know that you can't just make substitutions and hope for the best. This is a study that happened about 15 years ago when we ran out of a drug that is literally an extract of nitrogen mustard. So we've had this since World War I. It's not anything fancy or new. And we ran out of mechlorethamine, again, $100+ a vial, which is nothing in cancer care. And very well-meaning pediatric oncologists replaced that with a different drug called cyclophosphamide. And they basically said, we think it's going to be just as good, and we're going to see what happens. Well, if you look at the Kaplan-Meier curve at the bottom, what happens is kids have recurrent cancer and die when they don't get the drug they're supposed to get. So this curve shows that survival with tried and true drugs at a couple of years or 10 years even is around 90%. But if you look at the curve for the replacement, which was done in a very well-meaning way by very smart people, 4 out of 10 of those kids, roughly, had a recurrent cancer. We also know that people die from this. So I told you it wasn't going to be a happy talk. People die from this even when there are replacements that we know are just as good. So this is a study from ICUs that ran out of drugs that are used to keep people's blood pressure up when they're critically ill. We have a ton of these drugs. It's not like you only have one of them. But when you're using the one that you're used to, we have routines and things happen routinely. When you replace it in a different bag, at a different speed, at a different dose, and a tech needs to prepare it, and a nurse needs to deliver it, and a doctor needs to order it and reorder it and check it, all of those create possibilities for either errors or undue effects that we might not anticipate. And what this curve shows is that in hospitals that ran out of that drug that we had 10 other replacements for, survival was lower. More people died. So this is also showing how these cause errors, which is hard to measure. You don't always know exactly how or when that happens, but we know it happens. And part of the reason why is 95% of trainees, who are the lifeblood of most academic teaching hospitals, are dealing with shortages without any training in how to do so. They're making the best with what they have. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but just because no one's really necessarily trained to say, well, what do you do when you run out of this? Or when the pharmacy says, can we use this as a replacement? It's also really, really expensive. And these are underestimates because it's hard to get the total numbers right. But drug shortages cost somewhere on the order of $400 million to $600 million a year in absolute cost of the medications themselves. But when you build in labor hours, 9 million incremental labor hours were spent by pharmacists, pharmacy techs, and people like me trying to mitigate, prevent, and deal with drug shortages. 9 million hours a year. And that's probably an underestimate. And every individual hospital is absorbing hundreds of millions of dollars a year in other expenses. For example, certain drugs need to be given in a machine where it's pumped in and kind of dripped in a mechanical way. That's not a big deal, except when you need to use that, when you weren't used to it, it means you need more pumps. So in 1 year, Michigan Medicine spent $1 million just to rent pumps to make up for the fact that we ran out of one of the drugs that doesn't need a pump. This doesn't talk about the time allotment, the difficulty in the fact that we literally have 2 full-time pharmacists at Michigan Medicine whose only job is to make sure that the cupboards are full, to watch out for shortages on the national level, to anticipate them, to make sure what we have isn't going to expire, to make sure we're not stockpiling or hoarding in a way that's affecting other hospitals, to answer calls from other hospitals or other patients who are frantic to get a medication that they should be getting. And obviously, the interpersonal strife of what do you tell your patient? I know what drug is going to cure your cancer. It's cheap. Insurance will cover it, but we're out of it. And we don't know when the truck's going to come with the next shipment. And we're not sure whether we should give it to you or the other guy in the waiting room or the baby in Mott. Right? No way to put a price on what that feels like. The impact is broad. 96% of anesthesiologists had to change the way they put people to sleep because of these shortages in 1 year. In another situation, Virginia, the state of Virginia, ran out of a medication used to keep people from moving during surgery. And again, as a surgeon, that's important because the local prison bought out that supply to make sure they had enough for capital punishment. So drug shortages also put us into situations that are ethically impossible. These are some quotes. I'll read a few of them. 2 kids in front of you. You only have enough for one. How do you choose? We've been forced into what's considered a highly unethical corner. That's written by the then U.S. Disaster mitigation manager, which is not necessarily what you want to hear your mitigation manager saying at the federal level. Another way to frame this is around a national security threat. 80% of the drugs and their precursors that we get here in the United States come from abroad, mostly from China and India. Not necessarily a bad thing until, a pandemic happens and you can't necessarily get shipments and the entire supply line shuts down. Or, a bridge goes down and you can't get a boat into a harbor which is bringing medications. It's a little bit of an exaggeration. Most of those boats were carrying cars, but you get the idea of how unpredictable this is. Also, China is not necessarily our best friend, and whether or not you want to get into the geopolitical strife and politics related to whether or not China is a friend or a foe, we don't necessarily want to be relying on countries that we have strained relationships with for 80% of the drugs that we use in this country. I'm not going to dwell on this. The question always comes up, what drugs do we run out of? The short answer is mostly tried and true cheap ones, and I'll talk about why in a few slides. So things that we typically run out of: antibiotics, pain medication and things used in anesthesia, cancer drugs, and salt water and baking soda. Right? How do you run out of salt water and baking soda? I'll tell you in another slide. So why do these happen? Manufacturing problems are the biggest reason. Economic priorities, which I'll talk about in a second. The fact that there's no way to know what we're about to run out of until we run out. And very rarely the fact that we run out of the raw materials, right? It's not like we ran out of salt. So this is a slide, again, I know these are hard to read at the back. I don't want you to focus on them. This is showing the reasons for drug shortages in this country in 2022 that were reported to FDA. So for someone at the front, can you just yell out which the biggest box is? Unknown. 60% of drug shortages are from unknown causes. Now, the next question, of course, is how are they unknown? Well, they're unknown to the federal government because the federal government cannot mandate that companies tell them why they run out of a drug. And then your next question, of course, is, well, why wouldn't companies just tell you? Well, because most of these companies are publicly traded, and they don't necessarily want to say that the reason we ran out of this is because it's made in a factory in India that was last updated in 1974 and has a huge fungal outbreak. Stockholders don't necessarily want to hear that. And if the company doesn't have to share that, then you bet the federal government isn't going to know. So part of the challenge here is, what drugs do we run out of? Generic sterile injectables. That's one category of drugs. So these are drugs that are not brand name. They've typically been around for decades. They typically are very effective. They're typically only made by a few companies because they're so cheap that when you're making pennies on your dollar, not that many people are going to want to make it. The only way you get any money out of that is making it in bulk. And also, they're very complicated because they're very high risk for contamination because they need to be sterile. So you need to prepare them in a factory that is purely dedicated to making sterile injectables, that is incredibly clean, that takes that product, puts it in a bag, adds some salt water, packages it, sterilizes it, and ships it. These also generally don't have a high shelf life, so you can't just leave millions of them in a warehouse because then they're going to expire. And anybody who knows anything about economics knows when you're making pennies on your dollar, you lose your profit when things expire and you throw them out. Right? You need things to come in and out the door quickly. So when you have a few companies making something that costs $12 a vial, and there's no incentive to spend $300 million to build a new factory to make the drug that you're getting pennies for, you're in the situation that we're in, with 500 drug shortages a year on drugs that are tried and true and dirt cheap, and the federal government says we don't know why you ran out. You can broaden this and talk about other shortages, so blood products, organs, oxygen, lots of other things. I'm not going to focus on that right now, but there's lots of other things that we run out of as well. So this is a slide showing Hurricane Maria, which took out the Baxter plant in Puerto Rico a couple of years ago. I told you I would tell you about salt water. That's how we ran out of salt water, because that Baxter plant made the vast majority of what are called IV mini bags, which are 50 cc, small little volume, of salt water that are really efficient ways of mixing medications and putting them in drips to put into patients, which saves you from having to use those pumps. So Hurricane Maria happened. The national supply of little bags of salt water got cut by 2/3 overnight, and we spent $1 million on pumps that we otherwise wouldn't have needed. And now why, might you ask, why isn't everybody else making little bags of salt water? Somebody? Yeah, pennies on the dollar, right? You're not going to make any profit unless you're making a ton of it and you have a very small amount of inventory that otherwise might go bad or expire. So again, basic economics. This is how we're in this situation. These drugs are dirt cheap. They're generics. There's price caps on them, so they can't raise the prices. And you don't want to get into the Shkreli situation with EpiPens where you just skyrocket the price of things because that has other consequences which are very real. And not every other company is going to want to get in the business of spending hundreds of millions on a new factory for something that isn't going to turn into a profit. Why not just make one of the new biologics that costs $50,000 a month that insurance may or may not cover, that is going to make your shareholders a lot happier? So that's the broad overview of the economics and the national situation. Now let's talk a little bit about the local situation. So autonomy, so these are the 4 principles of medical ethics. I'm not going to dwell on them, but it's important to bring them up. Autonomy, right, honoring patients' voices and giving them the ability to make choices. Beneficence, doing good, helping people. Non-malfeasance, avoiding harm, minimizing harm. And justice, being fair and open. Sounds great. Problem is that drug shortages create situations where these directly conflict. I can't give you what you want. I can't do best for you. And I might harm you because I don't have enough for you and you and you and you and you. And I don't know when the next shipment's coming in. So broadly, another way to think about this is through a public health lens of ethics, which is thinking about the benefit for everybody versus thinking about the benefit for the individual patient. So that brings us to the R word, right? So rationing sounds like a really dirty word and everybody hates using it, right? We ration all the time, though. All the time, in different ways, both implicitly as well as explicitly. And I would argue that there's nothing wrong with being transparent and creating prioritization rubrics for things that we run out of, right? If there's 18 slices of cake up there and there's 95 of you, we have to figure out who gets the cake, right? Same idea applies to rationing in the hospital. Another problem with this, though, is that we can't have individual providers, doctors like me or nurses or anyone else, deciding who gets what when they're talking about their own patients, right? If Bobby and Jim are both in this room and they're both my patients with cancer, I don't decide who's more worthy. That's not fair, because my job is to look out for their best interest, to do everything I can for Bobby and Jim. So we need a rationing policy that transcends that dyad between me and my patient. It needs to be broader. It needs to be at the institutional level or the organizational level or the national level and so on. So how do we do that? Well, in this country, the way that we've historically rationed is, do you have insurance and can you get into a doctor's office, right? Not fair at all, but that's how we've done it. Not going to get into the broader issues of healthcare access, but that is the default system of rationing that has existed in this country. But it's different when you're dealing with a formal situation like this, where who gets the cancer drug. You need to think about all the stakeholders. You need to think about the patients, the doctors, all of the other people involved in the process. You need to think about that supply and demand ebb and flow. I don't know when the next shipment's coming in. And it can't just rely on me deciding who's more worthy than somebody else without data behind that. So we need criteria, and I wrote about this 15, 12 years ago, something like that are evidence-based, meaning that we have the best data to inform that. Transparent, meaning we share it with everybody. Everybody knows who's getting what and why. Universal, meaning no special people. I don't care if you donated to the hospital. I don't care if you're a doctor. You get the same prioritization as anyone else. And objective, meaning it's not based on your self-worth or my judgment of your self-worth or whether you have kids or whether you have a job or anything like that. But it gets really messy really quickly. Often we don't have data to compare things against each other. I don't know whether Bob or Jim or Frank is a better candidate for this drug necessarily. Nobody's done that research study. How about amount of drug? So a lot of these are weight-based or time-based. So do we give it to the folks who need less? But does that mean we discriminate against bigger people? Is that fair? What about first come, first serve? That's another way that you might say makes sense. Well, whoever's here first gets it. But guess who shows up first? It's the guy with the Maserati who doesn't have a blue-collar job. It's not Frank the plumber who can't get off of work and needs to take the bus. Supply and demand, I know I keep coming to this, but we don't know what's coming in when. And that is so challenging for hospitals to make decisions. And then the other question of, do we prioritize people on research protocols or not? Recognizing that people on research protocols are creating generalizable knowledge for the future, and a ton of national NIH money is actually spent on putting people on those trials, which is obviously very important. But also, if we tell folks you're only going to get this drug if you join a research trial, that's coercing them into something that they may not otherwise want to do, and we need to be careful about that as well. So you need an approach, you need a rubric, you need committees. I run hours here at Michigan Medicine. It's multidisciplinary. It involves pharmacists, it involves administrators, it involves patient advocates and representatives, it involves the doctors involved in whatever that shortage might be. And we meet ad hoc on whatever basis we need to when we get that call that we're running out of something. Many of these schema require prioritization according to a rubric, and what I mean by that is, since I don't know when the next shipment's coming in, we may say we're going to prioritize head and neck cancers, and then if we have enough, it's going to go to the folks with genitourinary cancer, and if we have enough, it's going to go to the kids with neuroblastoma. And obviously I'm making that up, but those are the kinds of rubrics that we create, and we'll draw the line in a different place based on how much we have on any given week or day. So one example of this is methotrexate. This is a drug that's used. It's an immunosuppressant that's also a cancer drug. It's used very often. And when we had this particular shortage, we shortened it to only folks with acute leukemia on a specific protocol and those with a certain kind of bone cancer, because our cancer docs told us those were the highest priority for this drug. What that meant was other folks with other kinds of cancer, or people with recurrent cancer, or people with autoimmune conditions weren't going to get it. Not saying that's the only way to do it, but that's where we drew our line for this particular shortage. Another thing that we learned by having pharmacists in the room was that the doses are calculated by weight appropriately, but that the vials are 50 milligrams, meaning that if you can round down, you can save a vial. So one thing that we learned how to do was round down in a way to make the best of it. There's been other situations with multi-use vials where we literally were able to use the drops at the bottom of the vial left over from someone to save the life of a kid with cancer, because we basically were able to double use the drops that literally were left at the bottom of the vial. Great that we were able to do it, tragic that we had to do it. Another thing, Michigan Medicine, like I said, we employ people whose only job is to make sure we have enough. That doesn't happen in Muskegon. That doesn't happen in certain parts of Detroit. That certainly doesn't happen in the UP. So there's an inherent unfairness in the marketplace that we also have to recognize and try to mitigate as best as we can. I'll get to how in a few slides. So there's no coordinated approach at the federal level to deal with this. There's no coordinated approach at the state level to deal with this. Right now, I have no idea how much cisplatin is sitting on the shelves at St. Joe's, or in Muskegon, or in Detroit, or in the UP. There's no system to do that. We can get on the phone and call them. They may or may not answer. They may or may not know. We may get the right person. We may not. We don't know how they're prioritizing who gets what, or whether Joe or Bob or Jim is going to get the drug first in Muskegon versus here. We don't know whether they have extra that's about to expire that we could use. We don't know if they have a patient that could be sent here for us to take care of here. You get the complexity. So the only way we're going to solve this, and I said this at the beginning, is with federal action. We need federal legislation that's going to do a number of things. We need to empower FDA and other agencies to actually force companies to tell them why there's a shortage. We also need ways for hospitals to be able to work together and to mitigate some of the complexity involved in knowing who to call and when and how and what. So progress has been made. We're better than we were, but nowhere near where we need to be. So FDASIA was an amendment to the FDA that happened about 10 years ago under Obama, and it was a great step that at least forced companies to say when there was a shortage. Before then, they didn't even need to say they were about to run out of something. So at least they have to tell us when they're going to run out of something now. Next step, of course, is to say why and to add every other piece of information that we need. The other thing that this law did, which was a good thing, was it empowered FDA to bring in foreign supply of drug that otherwise wasn't FDA certified, but was better than nothing in times of crisis. So that's the law. I'm going to skip that. So other ways of dealing with this, it would be great if FDA could certify the quality of a product. Right now, it's purely pass-fail. So when FDA approves a drug, it's either good enough to go out to the country, or it is not good enough and it can't be sold. It would be great, though, if there's a way of saying, this is made in a high-quality facility where they've guaranteed supply for a year, we've inspected them, they're good to go, we have no concerns, they've updated their quality controls, whatever it may be. Right now, we have no way of knowing that. And when we buy drugs, we're buying drug based on what's cheap. Why? Because when I give cisplatin in the hospital, I'm not billing for it. It's part of a DRG and it's part of their care. So we absorb that cost at the hospital and get paid a blank rate for the care of that patient. What that means, though, is hospitals have zero incentive to spend extra money on drugs that they're literally not even getting paid for. Doesn't mean that we're not doing it. In fact, we actually are. Whenever that shortage happens, we spend millions of dollars buying it on the gray market, recognizing that that doesn't always, financially it's a terrible thing to do, but also you're not always going to be able to even get it. So there's other reports on this. So this is a report that came out of our Senator Peters and the Homeland Security and Government Affairs group in the Senate, their committee, which I helped them put together. And then FDA has a report on this that actually came out right before the pandemic as well. The next question, that everybody asks is, well, what about COVID? COVID made everything worse, but didn't create any of these problems. They all existed long before COVID, but COVID made everything harder. There's some beautiful reports on what we need to do legislatively. The really frustrating thing here is we just need Congress to act. We know what needs to be done. So one of the things that this does is it combines push incentive, and when I say a push incentive, I mean requiring or motivating companies to improve infrastructure. Different ways that can work is an interest-free loan from the federal government to pharma to say we're going to give you $300 million if you build a factory that makes more cisplatin, and you only get that $300 million after you've proven to us that you've actually done that and created it and we have it. There's other different ways of framing that. Politically, it's contentious because certain members of certain parties don't want to spend more federal dollars. Certain members of other federal parties don't want to be giving handouts to pharma and everything that comes in between that. So threading the needle on how to solve this in a way that is palatable to both parties is tricky. But everybody can agree that we shouldn't be relying on China, which is one of the reasons why a lot of this is going through Homeland Security in the Senate. You might say, why Homeland Security and not HUP or HELP? Well, the reason is if you frame it around Homeland Security, you're more likely to get bipartisan buy-in for it. And everybody can recognize that little babies shouldn't be reliant on whether I can squeeze another drop out of the bottom of the vial. Our group here in Michigan, I've had the privilege of working with a number of legislators here. So I helped Rep. Slotkin on a specific act that is currently in committee in the House right now that is specifically designed to amend the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act to make the way expiration dates are put on vials a little more flexible, right? If you sniff the milk and drink it a day after it expires, you're probably going to be okay. Why is it that every drug can't be sold the day after it expires when we don't necessarily know whether it's unsafe? Can't we think about what that might look like in a world in which we are running out of things, and also in which we can do some very simple tests to determine whether that drug is still safe and effective after its expiration date? Companies don't want to do those experiments. Why? Number one, they cost money. And number two, why would you ever want to do something that is, by definition, going to cut the amount that you're selling, right? Same reason why iPhone batteries die after a few years. Another act that Peter's put out, which I think is a great step in the right direction, is to get a better handle on supply chain internationally and try to rein in reliance upon Chinese precursors for medications. We also took some action, which I'm particularly proud of. I worked with Peters and Slotkin and Stabenow and Debbie Dingle and others directly in response to the cisplatin shortage that we had. We actually wrote a letter to the FDA making very clear where we stood. And obviously it's not just us, other people took action as well. But the FDA Commissioner Califf, right after that, signed an approval to bring in an emergency supply from China and India of this drug that directly impacted the US supply and helped us take care of multiple patients. We're doing work at the state level as well on this problem, specifically looking at how we can allocate information better and share information better. Everyone across our state, I ran this study a number of years ago, right before the pandemic, agrees that it would be great if we can share drug or product or supply or even information, and we're trying to move in that direction, to do so interinstitutionally across different centers within the state. And the way we're doing that is through a group called YesRx. It's a brand new non-for-profit in the state of Michigan that is specifically designed, at least as of now, for cancer drugs, but will be broadened thereafter to be able to reuse and reapply and share information for drugs that are on shortage across our state. It is a small but meaningful step in the right direction. So drug shortages are a huge problem. They've been here for decades, and without sea change in Congress and significant action, they will be here for the next few decades at least. We need to invest in drugs the same way we invest in energy and water. Public-private partnerships are why the lights are on in here. I would say it's the same reason and the same impetus for making sure that people with cancer get the treatment that they need. We need to create rationing schema in the hospital that are fair, objective, evidence-based, and transparent. And I'm certainly working on that, although it is a moving target with all of the shortages we're dealing with and a massive amount of effort to make that happen. And we need to talk to our people in Congress, and we need to speak out about why this is such a major issue. Michigan Medicine has certainly taken a leadership role in this, although there's many, many other organizations that need to and are working on the problem. So thank you. I think Al told me to leave a bunch of time for comments and questions and discussion, so hopefully I have. And I will open the floor for anybody's comments. Thank you.
The question I had, I was interested, you were talking about medication that if you go into surgery that you need to stay asleep. What would how would a patient know there's a shortage if you're going to be going into surgery? Do you ask the doctor ahead of time or what?
So it's an interesting question. So for many of these shortages, we have reasonable alternatives and we'll use them. And the example of propofol is a good one where there's many other drugs that we use to put people to sleep. And in fact, that shortage right now at least has been resolved. The broader question is when we don't have an obvious equivalent treatment, we are very transparent about that. And we will talk to patients, and that often comes up in the cancer realm when we don't have the drug that they need. And that is an incredibly difficult conversation, and it's one that requires the oncologist, the cancer center communications team, the ethics group, and others to collaborate. But we are very direct and very transparent with people who are facing that problem. We also will encourage them, if they want, to try to seek care elsewhere, recognizing, as I said, that Michigan Medicine is more likely to have it than most other places are, but people are certainly welcome to try to find it somewhere else. And very rarely, but occasionally, we will postpone care if we don't have something that we absolutely need. That can be in the operating room or elsewhere. The example of that happened not that long ago was there was a COVID outbreak in Shanghai that took out a GE plant that made half of the country's IV contrast. And because of that, we stopped doing scans with IV contrast for a short period of time because we literally ran out of the agent.
Just a couple of questions. I guess, first of all, I have to apologize for bringing Andrew here. You're probably all depressed by now. But actually, the reverse of that, we need to know this. And there's just so much that I learned from those. Thanks, Andy, for bringing this information to us. Are there countries in the world that have treated the drug shortage better, that have, of all the things you talked about, that have a better model for us that we might follow? Is there anything along those lines that?
Yeah, so it is a broader issue internationally. It's not just the U.S. that deals with it. However, the way we price generics and the way our I hate to say this because a lot of folks will just say FDA is the problem with all of this, and I truly don't think that's the case. But there are some nuances of FDA that they make this more complicated in the U.S. than other countries. As an example, the EU deals with drug shortages differently, and it's a vast oversimplification, but you can think of each country in the EU almost equivalent to a state in terms of how there's broader regulation of drugs across the EU and then narrower rules within each country, but they do a better job of distributing resources and eliminating some of the financial barriers to being able to make these products. There are lots of other countries where the frank answer is we have no idea. One nice thing about FDA and ASHP is we have very good data on what things look like in the US, on how bad this problem is. I would venture to guess that it's equally bad and or worse a whole lot of other places, and we literally don't know because those data aren't generated.
When your ethics committee, how many of your peers, medical peers, do you think really come to your ethics group, and do they listen to you? Do they obligated to listen to you?
Yeah, so when we're allocating a drug on a critical shortage, that's not being done at the individual level of a provider. So at the institutional level, we are rationing and allocating that drug when we truly are in that kind of a shortage. So it's not up to any individual provider to call us and proactively tell us that they're running out of something or whether or not they should give it. We're regulating that much more centrally at the institution. However, in private oncology practices, I have absolutely no idea. And my guess is many of those smaller, less resource-intensive practices are doing the best they can on a whim at the bedside. And there are some national guidance on how to do that better, but I 100% share your concern that much of this is being done essentially on a whim in places without a larger institutional resource like we have.
One question I have is, as Michigan Medicine is acquiring hospitals around the state, my first thought is that would actually be a plus in terms of drug allocation and making decisions about who's getting what and shortages, because there's a more coordinated system, assuming those systems talk to each other.
Yeah. And that in that the hospital, like whether or not there's a Block M flying outside of the emergency room doesn't necessarily mean that the systems are coordinated and the people are necessarily talking to each other. With some of our partners, that is true. With others, it's less true. And with others, it's being built. Also, many of those institutions aren't in a situation where we can literally just ship patients or a drug from one way or the other. It doesn't necessarily work that way. And it's also challenging because if, for example, Rogel Cancer Center is now responsible for millions of more people across the state to coordinate their cancer care, it's not like our supply of cancer drugs magically just ballooned. So we may become in a situation where more people are coming down to Ann Arbor assuming that we're going to have it, and in fact, our cupboards may be dry even quicker because so many more people are coming here for care. So not to say that that's the only way that this could play out, but it's not necessarily the case that the larger and more complicated the institution is, the more drug you're going to have.
I wondered when the FDA stopped that company in India. When did that happen?
Last summer.
Last summer.
And that was one specific instance. Again, there's 300 others that I could have told you about, but that one was last summer.
Okay, and then the second thing was these slides were very informative, and I wonder if you'd mind sharing them with us.
Sure.
Thank you.
Are there also significant problems with oral medications, across the board? Hospital formularies are really big, and I don't know, there's so many drugs for cardiac, for any number of things, and I just wondered if you might comment on that.
Yeah, so the majority of the terrible shortages are generic sterile injectables for the reasons that we talked about. Doesn't mean we don't run out of other things too. And one of the oral drugs that has been particularly challenging have been drugs for attention deficit disorder that have been short nationally for multiple different reasons. Part of them is they're generic and cheap. Part of them relates to some more complicated regulatory side of things. So yes, we do occasionally have issues with oral drugs, but way less so than the generic sterile injectables.
It looks like you've done a great job with some of the legislators, but what is your degree of optimism that the federal government's going to do something?
I can't be a cancer surgeon without being optimistic, right? And I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think we were moving the needle. There's, by my last count, 8 bills that are at least in committee that are being vetted, all of which are bipartisan right now. So I am optimistic that we will move the needle and we will engender some positive change. I'm not optimistic that we're going to eliminate the issue with drug shortages anytime soon. But I do think that incremental movement is happening and will continue to happen.
Maybe the issue that scares me the most is the China makes, what did you say, 80% or something of our drugs, and they aren't our best friends right now. And maybe there's not an answer to this, but what do we do if we, I don't know, get in a war? It doesn't have to be a war; it can be an economic war, as opposed to a physical war. What options do we have? I mean, we could be. This is bad now, but that would just make it horrible.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to be, a catastrophist, so to speak, but if we were to lose access to Chinese drug ingredients and supply, the American healthcare system would collapse. The ways around that are to diversify our supply chain, which is that law that I just talked about, to create additional redundancy, and frankly, to bring manufacturing back to American soil. That is something that politically has a little bit more leverage to bring jobs and factories back here. However, it also requires quite a bit of financial investment, right? One factory is a couple $100 million. So yes, that would be fantastic, And I do think that's a necessary step. But in a very complicated geopolitical world, I don't think we're ever going to stop relying on foreign drug, nor do I think we have to, but I do think we need more redundancy. Not as much as you'd think. So raw materials are, it's not nothing, but it's not the biggest part of the problem.
Any last questions? Dr. Shuman, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Really